All right. So I decided to just do an audio podcast because I'm painting now and I'm using my computer to draw from. And so while I'm making and working on this painting, I came across a just barely recorded discussion with JoelDavis on the Aarvoll channel. It's just really uh, Eric's channel. And I got about 20 minutes in, and I decided I'm going to rewind it to about the 5 minute and 30-second marker and just kind of play it because it seems kind of nice. I mean, I'm in my 40s. These guys are like putting around their mid late 20s, maybe early 30s max, and they have their opinions and their views on things philosophically speaking. And Aarvoll, I'm going to try to get used to calling him Aarvoll instead of Eric, but Aarvoll has this need to ground or approach metaphysics, and it's kind of interesting because he had mentioned something about the holographic effect at one point, and I was elaborating to other people a notion of kind of what an echo might be. And then in a recent video, he talked about how his daughter seems to speak words that he's thinking, and I thought that seemed like a type of a telekinesis that would be justified through an unfolding holographic effect, or a type of echo. And so I thought, because these guys are bringing up a few names, Heidegger and Derrida, Duluth, I'm not too steeped in, but I read Heidegger's, being in nothingness about a decade ago, and before and after that, I've been reading Derrida, and I'm familiar with left and right politics, as well as the idea of critical theory. But what the topic seems to be, Eric wants to speak. They're trying to speak about metaphysics, and this fellow JoelDavis, who I'm entirely unfamiliar with, is kind of speaking in a heady way, almost like he's an academic that just rolled out of the School of Philosophy. And another thing Eric had mentioned before was something about the schools of, kind of like getting the foundation of philosophy. So he's starting with kind of the Plato's Republic and the Aristotle, and kind of bouncing things off of there. And it's not like he's not familiar with certain essays or certain basic ideas. So it is interesting to see how classical he is. I don't know if the other guy's a father. Eric's a father. He's been questing for knowledge and so forth. Anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and start this, and then periodically comment in at about the 5:30 marker. This was a stream. It looked like it was about 3 hours ago, recorded today, which I believe is the 13th of April. Here we go.
It distinguishes itself from these ideological discourses that are kind of modernist, and we'll get to why I disagree. I agree with them. Inherently problematic in their kind of ontological structure. I find them to become paradoxical and incoherent. And this kind of translates into the kind of ideological fracturing that we see across our society now, in my opinion, where we have kind of this far left and far right that see each other as mortal enemies, and now almost even the mainstream left and right see each other as one another's mortal and have a sense of cohesion in our society, I guess a kind of shared overarching vision about who we are and what we're doing. Everything is kind of ideological team sports in terms of politics, where each side is kind of jostling for power, and there doesn't really seem to be a way out of this toward a consensus by just simply adopting a particular ideological viewpoint and asserting it and competing for it against the others. Of these fatal flaws and these evident structures that make them unpalatable to the rest of society. And so in response to this, I guess what I'm trying to do with my YouTube channel and with my just general research and collaborations is to figure out how to develop an approach to morality and approach to politics that is completely post-ideological or post-metaphysical.
Okay, so right there, I think it's an honorable quest, but I mean, I think Derrida died in, I think it was 96, maybe 2006. I think it was 96, right? And so this idea of postmodern has been being shot around like a catchphrase because of that fuckwad Jordan B. Peterson, who totally misdescribes or wrongly describes and never quotes Derrida. You can never get the guy to quote a passage. But and I do like the idea, you know, in the internet age of people attempting to reformulate what's kind of been kicked around since the 70s, basically. I mean, I mean, granted, the you know, other postmodernists you could say came before, and I think Foucault's still alive, right? But it is interesting, kind of the fresh off the boat attempt. So I'm glad to hear that there is an attempt on his part to kind of. I think he used the word approach something that is post-ideological. And right out of the gate, when I first heard them speak of this, I thought that the problems with this notion of transcending or bringing people to a post-ideological space was that you were already going to bump into the problem of people who are cardinal in origin, like not mutable, and that they are they're not as well educated, and that they do hold on to ideologies, and that they do adhere to the movement of the herd and the claims. And I don't think that any human doesn't follow, plagiarize, and or create and manifest their position. So I think out of the gate he's going to have a problem. I haven't, like I said, got past 20-minute marker yet, so I'm not certain how Eric's going to address this or retackle it. He was about ready to retackle it, and then I hopped in the shower and decided, when I got out, like, okay, I'm going to make a video on this. So here we go again. I'll let him speak.
And the way that I've kind of found is to look toward sociology as a discipline, and through kind of recognition of the social organism and social being as in one sense, an indivisible unit of existence, in the sense that society has emergent properties that are more than just the mere sum of its parts. That society is more than just the individuals that make it up. In the same way that you could take oxygen and blow it on a fire and it would act as a fuel, or you could take hydrogen and blow it also act as a fuel. You combine them together to create water, an emergent property forms, and you put that on water and it extinguishes the fire. And in the same way, individual human beings, when they kind of organized and structured into society's emergent properties, identify as primarily discursive properties, in the sense that they are structures of meaning, and structures of language, and structures of idea, emerge that are not otherwise present in any kind of pure individuality. And so this kind of synthesis between an analysis of meaning as such with an analysis of social being and kind of communal is the kind of intersection within which I'm trying to build a research program about how to find a new way to approach politics that can offer us a way out of these seemingly incongruent and unreconcilable ideological and paradoxes that make any kind of social science inherently problematic and impractical.
Right. And I appreciate that perspective. I really like what generative anthropology has come out with. You guys talk about on Doodle Tom's Discord. I know there's been some problems with the stream thus far. Hopefully you were able to hear what Joel said. But I reduced the quality. It should be good now. So there are a few things that I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit more. And you said that you would extrapolate on why you, with the postmodern view, that we can have a post-metaphysical, and then how would you approach questions of essence in light of that? And then let me just get also your take on my view that these political differences have a source that can be traced back to differences in the way that we make meaning out of the world, the way that logical sense. And so if we clarify that fundamental epistemology, then we might be able to bridge some of these gaps just through a reasoned approach, from my side. But so those two issues, how do you approach the question of essence, and then how do you approach the question of epistemology?
Okay, so a good place to start is probably with Derrida's concept of difference as a way of deconstructing metaphysical discourse. And so any metaphysical argument is necessarily structured in a kind of propositional form. You start with one proposition that has to be some kind of original proposition, which upon its authority, you reason from it to reach several conclusions about reality as such. The problem with this is that when you to posit this kind of original authoritative proposition implicate some kind of even more fundamental or essential grounding that we can never truly grasp through language. And what I mean by this is, if you consider the meaning of, say proposition A, ask you, okay, so what does define this proposition A that you're reasoning from? And so we go and look up the words that are constructed in the dictionary. They have a series of other meanings, and then to understand, a series of other definitions, and then to understand those definitions, there's a series of other definitions, and so forth. And so what is meant by difference is that meaning is always perpetually and recursive. To define one thing only begs the question of some other more essential thing that needs to be defined. And this is a similar argument that you make when you talk about the kind of impossibility of some kind of first cause.
Okay, right out of the gate, I want to say he's incorrect, meaning that Derrida can make kind of a general notion, but what this guy's claiming is something that Derrida doesn't necessarily claim. Difference per se is the distinction between the graphemine and the phoneme, right? And so if I write something and hand it to you, it has a different authoritative relationship than if I speak it to you. And then if you look at the essence or the attributes of the sentence itself, whether you're hearing it or reading it, then the appeal to the authority comes into play, right? And so I believe that a metaphysics, in my particular approach to metaphysics, would be to index and articulate the type of perception. You'd want to gather information on what one is apprehending about the sentence, get them to make a further claim, because that's one thing Derrida does mention, is that there's always a next sentence. There's always another discourse about a dialogue, right? And such that the besides the extension of the discourse, a metaphysic could be upon interrogating an individual at that point, right? Assuming that you have whoever's reading or apprehending the writing is present, right? And then at that point, you'd be able to index something between the ethos, the ontologic, the phenomenologic, and the epistemological frame. And within that kind of scope or that sphere of those four differences, you'd be able to find out, what they're apprehending, what they're perceiving, to what extent do they know, to what extent are they referencing something? Are they referencing another proposition? Are they referencing a knowledge state? Is it a matter of something that's a priori? Is it something that they're conditioned through an experience? Anyway, back to this guy. So I've already got out of the gate. I already had an issue with how he was describing Derrida, but a lot of people like to kind of slack-jawedly, make summations of authors that I think, they need therapy.
Called temporal B theory, right? That there has to be, that it's kind of rational to assume, or paradoxical to assume, that there was some kind of origin to the universe, because that begs the question of what caused that origin, and therefore you're kind of always just reaching further and further toward this impossible origin. And I believe this is the same thing with metaphysical propositions. So that's kind of...
So Schopenhauer would address that by saying that our concepts are grounded in percepts, so they do have a terminus, an ultimate referent, indirect experience. And so my view of metaphysics would be that it must necessarily refer us back to a state of experience that we kind of intersubjectively by testing at an experiential level through things like, I don't know, yoga, meditation, stuff.
Okay, now notice that Eric here is he's gonna speak of experience in which to ground things, and I think ultimately this Joel fella, he will in a way capitulate to that position.
Along those lines, we can also kind of try to refer to these experiential states and guide each other to these experiential states using concepts. So that would be the ultimate terminus of metaphysical reference, in my view. What do you make of that?
Okay, I'm not against, like, don't misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm not like trying to posit that there is no such thing as epistemology. There's no reasonable epistemology that we shouldn't kind of pragmatically look to verify as some kind of correspondence with our experience. I believe that all that stuff is very good and necessary. The problem, though, with metaphysics is that it kind of asserts that our individual, it depends on what kind of metaphysical system you're using. But if you want to try and ground a proposition in experience, and then that's still a reasoning that our experience somehow has some kind of validity or authority, truth as such, and then we can reason from there. And I believe that this is problematic if it becomes kind of ontological. If a proposition A agrees with experience B, therefore proposition A is true, I would say proposition A. But I don't think that's the same thing as true. Or if it is, then it's a very different conception of truth than what is commonly understood as true. And so I'm a pragmatist. I believe in a pragmatic approach to knowledge, and I'm also a constructivist. I believe that knowledge is this kind of creative human construct.
So he's saying he's got a pragmatic, meaning grounded, meaning almost empirical or normative approach to knowledge, and yet he's utilizing, kind of waxing over an abstract of kind of an indefinite appeal that is always deferred, right? And later on, I mean, we're still 10 minutes out before I've even gotten to the point where I haven't heard them yet. But between he'll bring up the current term of performance and that which is performative, and then try to speak about an analysis. Well, he doesn't go this far, but he brings up performative, and then and if Eric's bringing up experience, right, then you would have one's description or one's experience informing them from a subjective phenomenological point of view, as opposed to kind of a third party or a group referencing how one is performing, which would then make a kind of the law of the excluded middle would be focused on that particular indexing. But I'm just starting to develop, through this conversation, I'm trying to posit or develop a description of my metaphysic as kind of a voluminous positing of different indexings of these different intersections.
So it gets revised through more and more experience, and you could say that some kind of certainty at some point in the future, and maybe that's the case, but I don't believe we have grounds for that. I guess what I'm arguing for is a kind of philosophical humility, in the sense that we have a set of ideas about the world, and they might function, but subject to amendment and change. It's possible that new experiences, new information will come up in the future, and that will necessitate that we revise us. And I believe that we must be open and ready to synthesize these new experiences and constantly revise our concepts, rather than collapsing into some form of dogmatism, a false kind of metaphysical certainty as a kind of shortcut.
So what I find problematic is the idea that he's trying to straddle both sides of the fence, saying he's a pragmatist, but then he wants the individual to be able to renegotiate their position on things. And so his epistemology about the metaphysic is, I mean, he's still kind of painting it out as Eric's continuing the interrogation here.
Yeah, I think the notion of metaphysical is a good one. Hopefully the audio is equal now. And so the way I would look at it is that any metaphysical takes a role similar to descriptions of God in classical theism, meaning they must be, I'm probably way too loud now, they must be apophatic or analogic. So we do run into problems when we try to build like reified, hypostasized models of the ultimate ontological basis of things. It doesn't seem like the translation into language is possible. But by transitioning, this is kind of the perennialist view in part, by transitioning between many different models at a linguistic level, this guides us back to an initial state of being that is functional, it's compatible with this kind of constructivist kind of, you build concepts and Haitian to adapt to your circumstance, and they function or they don't function. And so all of these metaphysical descriptions ultimately have to refer back to a primary state of being, which we can talk about in metaphysical terms, we can talk about in epistemological terms, but ultimately it reduces down for me to an ethical discussion, because this mode of being either leads to the good life or it doesn't, and obviously we're all seeking the good life. So that's a good bridge into politics. But first, let's get a little bit deeper.
Well, and this is kind of the dogmatism that Eric seems to entail through his growth. I've watched him for a few, at least a couple of years now. We've had tangential engagement, but Eric is really wanting to ground, find how things are clicked together, and so he has an idea of, once again, the good per se, as if that is something that is shared. That the good is necessarily, good for what? Good for whom? Good for this culture or that culture? Is vegetarian good in this culture or that culture? What is the good, quote unquote, kind of a grand overarching goodness? You could still, throw an underscore a description of what the culture is, or what the idea of what one is trying to yield, as opposed to just speaking about an essence of goodness from which this claim positivity or success, reproductive success or happiness success or eschatological, approaching one's end or teleology in a type of a salvation good, or good for one's offspring, or good for one's society, sort of thing. So I do find it interesting that Eric keeps at that. It's almost as if it's the beginning of a musical score, the sitting down before he begins to play. He wants to make certain that there's something about the essence, about the good. So there isn't the notion of the dogmatic truth play. When I do get to reading my book on embedded contradiction, the first issuance, one of the first things I'm attempting to issue is something that a few other philosophers have tried to do, which is just critique and try to reapproach the concept of truth per se. But
into this kind of radical constructivist picture, you sent me an essay that I read, and it's how would you distinguish that position, which I might characterize briefly as the notion that we can't necessarily posit that our constructions in conceptually model some kind of extrinsic reality, that I said is more a matter of these modes of behavior function in a given context or they do not function. And how would you distinguish that from like the phenomenological reduction, where we say we're going to interpret phenomena and examine phenomena in terms of what's immediately presented, and not necessarily build these models about what it ultimately corresponds to out there. So what distinguishes radical constructivism, and then how does this political context?
Well, I'm no I haven't studied Husserl to some deep extent, so I'm no authority on the work of Husserl. So I would rather just not comment on Husserl, because it's not really my place to comment.
So not necessarily Husserl in particular, but like the fundamental method in general, which is just to bracket questions of elitist, bracketing questions of metaphysics, and deal with a description of what's immediately present. What distinguishes radical constructivism from that?
Well, I don't think that they are incompatible. I think phenomenological thinking is, and I believe that construction kind of corresponds to the constructivist understanding of knowledge as this kind of dynamic human endeavor, where individual communities and societies creatively generate ideas about, in the process of trying to live them out in some form of practice, learn lessons about their suitability and attempt to adapt them in areas where they aren't functioning correctly. And so phenomenology, by kind of fixating upon human experience as it appears to us, and just trying to pay very close attention to the way that we use symbols and signs to differentiate and represent differentiations in our experience is good, because it represents a kind of progression from a more traditional, naive mentality. But I think what makes radical constructivism separate is informed by, I think, the work of Piaget. Radical constructivism is informed by the work of Piaget, who, of course, had developed this kind of developmental understanding of how humans, from like babies onwards, epistemically developed their understanding of the world. He identified these key phases, age, making sense of their reality. And I think thinking in those terms is very useful, because rather than just positive kind of ultimate truth that we need to convince people of and realize, instead trying to understand truth as this dynamic process of constant learning and trial and error, and is, I think, far more useful, because it enables us to start with whatever we understand now and work from that and try and consistently improve it and build upon it, and then pass down that process to that kind of overall attitude to knowledge of not, we've got it all worked out, we just have to answer X, Y, Z, and then that's it, we've completed the project of knowledge. I think it's a far more grounded and realistic and useful way of approaching it. And as for politics, I think this is important when structured ideological.
Well, and herein lies the rub, that the abstract that he gave would require that more than the lion's share of individuals within a population would have this degree of sophistication and or the time to come to this degree of sophistication if he is going to speak about this. And it is interesting that he brought up, a child's experience. I bring in, you people want to dissect what it means to speak about what a prelingual child is going through before what I would say they acquire an epistemology, a sense of knowing, and as opposed to having a third person ascription of knowledge placed, projected onto the prelingual child, that one would have to reach a moment of recursion, recognition of sight and sound, and then they would retain, and as long as they retained something from the parental point of view and the parents' ascription of knowledge, then as the child's going through this experiential a posteriori landscape of interacting with the environment, until language is there, I wouldn't say that one has knowledge in the current philosophical use of the word knowledge, or maybe more of a precise way of using that.
Discourse. So if you take something like liberalism, in its kind of traditional form, liberalism starts with a set of presuppositions, like obviously famously the state of nature, as articulated in various ways by Rousseau or Locke, that society emerges as this mutually beneficial set of agreements between individuals to generate social and and then they reason from there to establish conceptions of human rights and so forth that justify the kind of parameters of a liberal legal system and moral outrage when free speech is violated or what have you. I think looking at political ideology, or just political thinking, I should probably say, as instead of this dynamic process where we come up with have some way of thinking of determining, is this working, is this not working, and then go back to the drawing board, adapt them, reconstruct them, improve them.
Okay, so when he uses the term dynamic, then what I'm looking for is whether or not he's going to try to qualify it with a soft edge adjective, like in some sort of way, we develop X, Y, and Z about this dynamic, right? And as opposed to like taking a Bayesian analysis of a Gaussian blur, like making whatever it was a static form, and reinterpreting the dynamic in terms of propositions and then reapproaching them in a static form. It appears that he himself is liberal and caught up in the minutia. But it's interesting where for me, when he's going to apply the terms of that which is dynamic as opposed to that which is static. So let's see, we're almost to where I left off.
Much more like scientific, I think, approach rather than this kind of ideological kind of purity of these are our principles of what is right and what is wrong. We're going to measure everything by them and have outrage at people who violate them. But there is also something also to be understood. Ideologies are themselves constructions, and I think this is where something like generative anthropology comes in. Understanding that the moral experiences that people have as liberals or as communists or whatever political ideal have, that they have still a kind of validity, not in the sense of being also, but in the sense of being real human experiences and seeking to understand how does one become a communist, how does one become a liberal, and so forth. I think these questions then who's right. And I think they will lead us more toward figuring out solutions as to how to all live in a society together, how to mitigate the different resentments and interests of the various classes, and how to build.
Okay, so if he wants to say the ideology is a construct, then I don't believe he's speaking about the individual's construction as they're entering into the lingual and cultural frame, as much as the whole history of humanity and language and people's performance and claims as it's yielded intergenerationally to the present. That one could speak of that itself as a construct, but recognizing that kind of the history of standing on giants, shoulders of giants, so to speak, or just standing, as the end result of a few thousand generations of Homo sapien. It seems to me that that description of a construct would be, a different indexing than just speaking about one's peer group system. It's the distinction between that which is contemporary, present, and that which is traditional and inherited.
Pragmatic solutions that can encourage the maximum amount of kind of cooperation and mutual benefit is ultimately, I think, has more potential to benefit everyone.
Sorry, I said contemporary. I meant conventional versus traditional. Conventional as that which is contemporary amongst living peers, not. But I meant conventional compared to traditional.
Reflected in argument and moral outrage, as I said.
And that seems to raise a few metaphysical issues in that this view of epistemology and ultimately kind of political and praxis refers to functionality. And so what does it mean to function? What is the essence of functionality? Because we're invoking this concept as kind of a bedrock structure of all other forms of meaning. So since it's so fundamental, how do you deal with that concept and not in a metaphysical way?
Yeah, so again, I think making reference to generative anthropology is useful here, and this is why in the first video I made on my channel, I called it postmodernism, because I wouldn't, for postmodernists, I wouldn't just do this kind of deconstruction of metaphysics and then just be satisfied. But I believe we need to find a way of grounding knowledge that isn't metaphysical, but nevertheless grounds knowledge. I believe that the solution to that is by grounding knowledge in kind of social performance or the experience of embeddedness within a community or within a social scene. I believe that this kind of embeddedness that we sense is something that doesn't necessarily have to be conceptualized to be real. In a sense, this is a kind of phenomenological argument that often we experience things like morality as intuitions, as being within a context, a social context, as opposed to here are my set of moral axioms, and then here's my argument as to why this thing is immoral. My brother is 14 years old, doesn't have hardly developed rational deduction. If he gets upset about what he perceives as a violation of morality in the family, he doesn't come up with some propositional argument about why it's wrong. He'll just explain his feelings, and then there's this kind of unspoken, intuitive understanding of that's not in the family.
Kind of unspoken, intuitive. So just, I don't mind him describing his brother that way, but it appears as if his, and he is appealing to an embeddedness. And I I agree that we should appeal to an embeddedness, but to where he's going to go, this is the end. This is as far as I got, by the way. I don't know where he's going to go. So it does sound as if he's going to have some qualifying, try to keep waxing over the groundedness and then appealing to maybe an entanglement or an embeddedness. I go right into contradiction. Let's just embed right into the paradox itself. If anything's an antinomy, then run that rough shot and then look at what the problems are after the fact, the inverse. Don't stop the discourse at the contradiction. Reapproach it well after the fact. Allow the contradiction to continue. So we'll allow this discussion. Now I'm curious to see how Eric's going to reapproach all this.
This is really how most people understand morality and understand social rules in general. It's very what Heidegger would call readiness to hand as opposed to presence at hand. It's contextual, I guess is my point. And so what generative anthropology does in its theory is it understands morality, truthhood or falsehood, but in terms of its purpose embedded within. So what makes a kind of community or a society possible? To GA, it is the individuals deferring their desire to appropriate objects, which would become problematic to maintaining communal peace if everybody pursued. So if you have a food object center of the community and every individual tries to appropriate it at the same time, enough to go around, there's scarce resources in general, and so you'll see violence and conflict as a way of resolving this. Or another way of resolving this is through developing a shared concept of sacrality, things that you can't touch, things that, to be a member of the community, to be a member of society, these are things that you can't do. And by not doing them and signaling that you're not going to do them, the other members of the community can recognize you and trust you as moral agents, and therefore that is the kind of bedrock underneath which kind of emerge that enables complex civilization to even be a thing that exists in the first place.
Well, and then he did speak on free speech, the Joel guy earlier, like the inflamed of those who are controlled in speech, and yet if he's looking for a type of accepted community, then and I do think that the deontologic kind of business structure that the left or academic institutions in the midst of the world of social media going global is attempting to relegate words and even approaches towards topics, if not the topics outright, as if one should not speak now online in any other manner than by following the deontologic rule systems of, let's say, a business, as if you were at work in an office building, right? And so obviously one can make signals within their group and their in-group and not make these violations. That's fine, but that seems as if that would be an old theory, not some postmodern theory. Anyway, let's continue here.
And so I guess what this is a way of having a teleological understanding of ethics rather than a metaphysical understanding of ethics. That ethics serves in society, and this function isn't something that I'm just arbitrarily positing. It's something that that you can be deduced from historical analysis, that morality and moral customs and rituals.
Like history, to use the word nigger, the N word, to requalify it, right? To eschew it in one case, to allow it in another case, to allow its attribution only within certain individuals that are said to qualify, to have an appropriate repose back to relegating and getting people to not utilize the word, such as a word policing, to kind of, in a way, demand. So now he is going to come down on this social point of view, I suspect, right? I'm speculating, so this is just conjecture on something I haven't heard because I don't know the guy. it'll be like petals on a tree. He'll want to segment each one out and use historical data. Like historically, the N-word causes this offense if used in these ways, this particular indexing or this group of indexings, such that we now know how to recategorize it and then implement it and then police it.
Of religious and political kind of forms emerge, society and community became possible. And as they evolve, different forms of society and community become possible. And so, living today after thousands of years of human civilizational and moral and linguistic evolution, we're at a point where there's a whole bunch of discourses, a whole bunch of moral ideas already functioning, churning away in our society. And what I argue is that by becoming aware of them and becoming conscious of them, we no longer need to come to have a justification forced on some kind of metaphysical principle. We understand them purely as these kind of fundamental conditions by which the kind of existence that we enjoy and expect from our everyday life becomes possible.
Okay, a fundamental. So now he's fundamental, right? Which is fine because he's trying to get as close or approximate kind of a fundamental position, and yet it's interesting where he'll wax off and allow a reapproach towards that which is contextual, but in this case, he wants to ground this particular thing as fundamental. So this is making up his like political metaphysic.
And so the fact that we're sitting here talking about these issues, the fact that we have a friendship, that we have interest in politics, interest in morality, all kind of that both of us want to have this idea of community, this idea of society that is linguistically mediated. And so taking that as a kind of place to reason from, I think it's possible to kind of justify the functionality of ethics. Not necessarily that we should have ethics because they're good, but because in order to have a society, these are the ethical structures we need. In order to have this kind of society, ethical structures that we need. And ultimately it's up to you whether you want to make that value judgment, whether you want to live in a society or you want to separate yourself from society. But under the assumption that you want to be in a society, these are the conditions. I mean, in our society, in our cultural, historical context, these are the conditions. And I believe that's a way of understanding these questions that doesn't necessarily appeal.
So it's very interesting that he's going to now like try to fundamentally ground on these are the conditions, like that there's going to be a rule book of who can say what and how they can say it, or who can behave or do certain things. And then once again, if we reapproach to someone emerging like a postlingual child that is now, like he referenced his 14-year-old brother, right? But one that is now migrating into social orders, there would have to be a sense of testing and reapproaching the boundaries, kind of like kids at play. Unless they're just demanded, they, like a lot of them, I imagine, stay quite quiet in fear of perhaps testing boundaries under an assumption of what it means to be in this society. And so already he's developing an in-group and an out-group, either you're with us or against us, to kind of allow him to ground in this.
Metaphysics in any way, because it's grounded in this real experience that is understood in a way that isn't necessarily propositional. I think the propositions come later to justify it, but it's understood intuitively.
He says it's understood intuitively, right? Like it's not like if I use the N-word or say nigger, right? If I say it being a Caucasian man, right? Then I can't appeal that being intuitive. I can say that the social feedback or having family members or other people say, hey, that's not appropriate, or shush, or give you a look, right? Then you're all of a sudden, oh, is my male organism not picking up my mother's cues, facial expressions? And he might just like wholesale call that an intuitive understanding. But once again, I'm trying not to defame him for being, young and just sounds like he's off of his master's degree in philosophy or something. And I like the idea of what he's saying, but I don't think that, I find it ironic which it also fulfills my my thesis of contradiction, that there must be a form of irony that's ongoing, but in so much so that once again you just point back to one's behavior and are you playing ball or are you not playing ball, right? Are you playing ball the way we want you to play ball or are you not playing ball? But he seems as if he's trying to develop a whole thesis or a doctrine that is sociologically sound and that we could actually roll out in a predictive fashion, as opposed to, let's say, well, both predictive and responsive to whatever the ongoing growth of society and individual disclosure is made public via the internet, and then whole levels of, oh, when is something forgiven, what groups are allowed to violate, what yeah, how long before we can reapproach. I'm over babbling. Back to these guys.
Understood performatively. Again, I guess that would be my general sketch.
Yes, and Watts established a distinction in his book on Christianity between metaphysics, which is this kind of more propositional, abstract language, and metaphysic, which is kind of a direct confrontation with being as it appears, as it is, not getting trapped in the abstractions. And there's a goading against a kind of mode of thought that leads to antisocial behavior and like natural domineering, because you're operating based on the assumption that this set of concepts about the ultimate nature of reality justifies you in oppressing other groups who are not acting in accordance with, or just not listening to where someone else is coming from. So there's definitely in metaphysical thinking that's very common. But what I do see happening is that basically this view, which is pragmatist in a way, this radical constructivist view of meaning building, appeals to the metaphysics of Schopenhauer. It appeals to the Nietzschean metaphysics of will. And so I still conceive of this in terms. I think that not a deconstruction, but an analysis of will as it appears is still a worthwhile endeavor, and that's what goes on in monasteries. That's what goes on among communities of ascetics, and there is an intersubjective social to that is still valuable. But it should be regarded as, because if every other form of meaning that we're going to use is going to be predicated on acts of will fundamentally, then the interface, intentionality, desire, and whatever else is in there, this kind of direct phenomenological analysis and like really getting at what it is in itself is a conversation that I think still needs to take place. But we should recognize what the appropriate place of that is. But I don't.
So Eric wants the conversation to take place, but now the how and when is under reapproach, is under consideration. It's interesting because I think Eric's mentioned that he hasn't read Derrida, but it sounds like he's read Schopenhauer. He's got some Nietzsche under his belt. And so, he's not going to use deconstruct. He'll use analysis in terms of his wordage. And but once again, Eric brought up kind of the notion of a Christian or a theological basis in which to ground one's metaphysic, in which to ground a structure of social and communal belief. He didn't say that, or mores. Let's continue.
It has to be relegated to a kind of mystical conversation, because Chris Langan, who deals with the underlying similarities or uniformities in any cognitive system whatsoever. So if we're going to analyze perception, analyze how the will interacts with representation, then we're going to be necessarily drawing categorical distinctions that enable us to kind of evaluate between each other that we're an essential being. Now, what Chris Langan refers to will be this kind of principle that any differentiation is necessarily predicated by some kind of common syntactic medium, which is similar to Kant's transcendental unity of apperception, right? The kind of wholeness or unitive experience of consciousness, and that kind of telling, and it seems to point to.
See, in Christopher Langan, he brings up syno difference or something to that effect, which is yeah, it's kind of it's kind of colliding of two ideas, like synthesis and syntactical differences, right? And in which one can then lay out kind of an expectation of like a landing strip of expectation of what we can uh, expect to see happen, and to how to approach these particular differences. And yet, something that was interesting about Langen, right, is that he, you know, supposedly ranking as the highest IQ guy, and for whatever one wants to grant to IQs, which I think one should one should really hold back and remediate their position away from just a wholehearted acceptance of what IQ is. Kind of an irony with Langen, and somebody else mentioned this, right? Not about Langen, but in general. They're basically saying if one is so smart as to not realize that their very attribution, or their speaking a topic itself would have, if someone's so smart that they're not able to recognize what the current political pushback would be on their sentiments, then they're maybe not all that smart after all. And I only bring that up because Langen made some comment talking about, I think it was the import and treatment of the highest or the smartest gorilla with a vocabulary, or some sort of understood phonic vocabulary and hand signaling that surpassed the IQs of those individuals in sub-Saharan Africa, or like the Congo, something like that. Like he went ahead and stated something like that to make to accept the average, right, of to both accept claims of IQ, then to claim the average, then claim the claim of IQ upon the ape, and so he himself didn't recognize his own his own lack. Like he wasn't careful with the distinction, or he was careless and about the fact that there was going to be pushback against that. And if anyone ever wants to argue about IQ, right? I mean, one of the first things, like Hades IQ, and then this is just this tangent for all y'all, right? There's this idea like, hey, look, if you're struggling for food, like as on a day-to-day basis, and someone puts an IQ test in front of you, more than likely you're going to score a lot less well on that test, even if somebody says, oh yeah, well, we adjusted the scores to make up for something like that, right? I don't believe it, right? Because if you have hungry people and their mind is on the acquisition of food out of the gate, to put a test in front of them, they may in mass perform much less. So you take these struggling groups of individuals that are in these areas that are looking for food or looking for nutrients, and you're applying these tests, and then you're shoring up the results as if the results have already been accounted for, and then you're adhering to the bell curve. You project the bell curve on top of that, believing that you've accounted for something, as if IQ is in fact reading the essence or the intrinsic IQ of a population. It's absolutely obscene. There's way too many caveats and exceptions. And those who would argue the other way about how well IQ tests actually do read intrinsic, I guess, mental, speeds or gears or number of gears that one has rotating in their eidetic head, their eidetic mind space. That to me is a type of idealism or a type of adhered to dogma. But back to these fuckers.
A kind of ultimate necessity to this unity, which is when then you would get into the whole array of cosmogonic myths relating to this. You can use Pythagorean, like, arithmological models where the monad or the unity begets the dyad or the multiplicity, and then the interactions lead to these in specific ways, set of basic principles that instantiate then in the material world this kind of unfoldation from that ultimate unity, which is extrapolated originally from the unit of experience of consciousness. There's all sorts of lines of investigation that we can go into once we open up that metaphysical ground. That is definitely an esoteric space, always has been, where you can look at the Neoplatonic or Gnostic versions or the Hindu version. These myths exist everywhere because it kind of, I don't want to look at it as metaphysics ontologized. I want to look at it as metaphysics of experience, looking at the most basic building blocks of experience. Because if we're saying that these concepts are rather constructed, then we're saying that they're built out of something. There's some kind of, dynamics of the system in which these concepts are constructed. And I wouldn't say that I have any hard and fast answers regarding exactly, but I'd like to keep it open. That's a conversation that can still be had. And I think it's not inappropriate to use the term metaphysics, but that's where I'm coming from with that.
I don't think that that's a problematic line of thinking. I think because ultimately what I'm saying is that ethics is built out of something, and that thing that it is built out of social performance and imitation and kind of a menace of being within the social.
And how do you, there's building blocks of the social, right? In order to have the social, necessarily rests on individuals being present. Maybe there are no true individuals, right? Like maybe my conception of myself isn't completely isolated, or my direct experience of myself isn't an individual experience. You are part of what I identify as myself. All of my experience ultimately is. But still, these higher order social processes seem to rely in place on principles like desire, intention being there. Wouldn't you say?
I would definitely agree that they rely upon some kind of desire or will being there. The problem, I think, comes up with kind of over-subjectivizing desire or will and kind of creating this identity out of desire or will. Because if you like a kind of analysis of our own sense of desire doesn't seem to be something that I choose or arbitrate. Desires seem to emerge within me. I think, I can't remember who this quote is from. I think it might have been Einstein. But nevertheless, the quote was something along the lines of, you can want what you will, but you can want. And I think that's very profound in the sense that ultimately the things that we desire, the intensities that we experience in the same way that we experience the intensities of sight, vision, sound, and temperature, or what have you. And that this idea is subject to the individual that's capable of reasoning and making response to those intensities. I think the mistake made by kind of Western metaphysics is to kind of take that reasoning, thinking intensity in place that is fundamental to all the others, and I think that they've got the all way wrong. And I think that ultimately thinking and reasoning and showing and differentiating is this later form that comes along and organizes all these more primordial intensities of experience. And I would consider the sense of morality, our sense of what is right or what is sacred, what is evil, is itself just another intensity. I know that guilt feels like an intensity, or shame feels like an intensity, or injustice when you see it happen, and if you can feel it as a kind of physical thing. It's not just an idea. It's not just a reasoned concept. And so I think grounding our understanding of morality and, by extension, ethics, in this recognition that these ideas have to be constructed out of these fundamental intensities of experience. They can't be. We don't have these like disinterested, just pure rational contemplating propositional arguments. And I think that's why I criticize metaphysics. I don't criticize the conclusions necessarily that some forms of metaphysics come to. I just criticize the way in which they get there. Not so much that if they get to the right conclusions, I guess to some extent I don't really care how they got there, but in the sense that misunderstanding or not taking into consideration different factors and how moral conclusions are arrived at, we can kind of make mistakes or paradoxes with our interpretation of morality when we try to institutionalize and bureaucratize and politicize them. And that's why that's kind of why I'm trying to think in this kind of speculative, different way about these problems, because if you look at the major discourses in our society today, if you look at the kind of SJWs, or like the anarcho-capitalists, or the neocons, or the mainline Democrat voter, I believe that all these groups share a fundamental conception of this kind of threatness of the individual and the individual.
Okay, so I find him interesting now, just on that last statement, that he believes that they share, because it appeared to me that he was kind of setting the stage to speak about how that these groups are unreconcilable. But I don't find him novel in him coming to this apex and in philosophy, and then driving it, or trying to develop something, a political motivation behind it. I just don't know how he's I don't find him novel, because I think plenty of people have spent their time trying to formulate an ideology based on their philosophical education, a political ideology. But nonetheless, he is interesting in that last statement that he made, where he's now going to say something that's kind of unifying amongst the groups, which is, yeah, it's more like watching. I mean, in one way, I see myself in both of these guys. And so, I mean, Eric's, root back to God, or some sort of Godhead, some sort of basis. And then this guy's kind of like touch and go, like watching a butterfly maybe land on something, denote it, and then fly off, and then re-land, and then not deny that it re-landed on it, or that it landed on it in the first place, and then say, well, all things can, not just butterflies can touch this ground. And so let's see where he goes from here.
Individuals' freedom to make choices, actualize, but they reason from this fundamental kind of idea of what is sacred to radically different political conclusions. And so I think this problem comes from just different lines of propositional arguments. If you look at at least the epistemology used by the neocons, it's very different from the kind of more objectivist, I would say naive objectivist interpretation made by like the Randians or the Austrian economists. And then this is radically different from some feminist reading of the SU left. And so I think finding a way to transcend these metaphysical disputes by trying to say, hey, all of these different kind of trajectories that all your discourses are heading from, they're all grounded in this same fundamental social process of trying to figure out how to create rules that hold social being together, mitigate conflict, mitigate resentments, and maintain peace and stability. I think can be very advantageous in trying to transcend these differences. And I think that's
isn't that the same thing as just the whatever law structures at hand? Isn't the law structure that one grows up within, the policies implemented an echo of previous ethos, from which it's derived, from which one can solve their differences? Or is he going to speak about individuals within a population's contentment? And it's almost like he's I mean, he's more or less speaking his desire to have some sort of like congruous, like a total agreement, a total sort of agreement on political ideology and appropriate behavior. But let's see where this goes.
It's kind of the domain analysis I'm focused on. I'm not focused on whether if someone wants to conceptualize some kind of metaphysical understanding of how to come to a conclusion about, just objectivity in some kind of scientific sense that's completely divorced from the social. But in terms of discourse, I don't think we have the luxury of continuing this like debate on metaphysics any longer, because it's not getting to any consensus. It's only fracturing into more and more different schools, more and more different interpretations. more and more arguments and less consensus and agreement.
So how would you respond to someone who said that these ethical differences originate with different propositional chains of argument or different metaphysical presuppositions, but rather originate from divergent interests, which are real divergent in tertiary sense? Different groups have different incentives, and then these propositional attitudes are really just kind of post hoc justifications of these original intentional, which are occurring at the same level of will as the basis of the proposed method of resolving these disputes. And so, I would then refer to metaphysics, way of mediating those disputes, in the same way that in the originary scene, the desire for the central object is mediated neant or gap created by the sign, and then the sign acts as a surrogate for the object of desire and thereby transforms the state of desire of the subjects there. In the same, our discussion of metaphysics and our examination of the nature of our desires and can then transform those intentions and desires and bring about harmonizing of that basic level state of objection.
Well, first of all, I agree with you that the reasons why different ideological members of which come to those different camps is because of different interests and different kind of positions in the kind of social organism that have like personality types and so forth. My point, though, is that the discourse that they use, insofar as we're talking about that, the discourse that they use justifies what they are saying based upon some kind of fundamentally metaphysical ideological argument, and by grounding what they're saying in this kind of social that I've articulated, that unconceals the differences for what they are, which is that you're arguing for the interests of your class and your particular mentality and your particular position. You're not arguing for some kind of transcendental moral principle that you're not the virtuous ones and everybody else is. Like every individual group is quite happy to make that analysis about the others, but they've got this special understanding of moral truth. And so what I'm trying to work out is a way of building discourse that interfaces with these different perspectives and just unconceals them and gets them to kind of get as close to speaking the truth about who they are as possible.
So it's interesting. Okay, so the difference between that which is like embedded in one's reading list as opposed to one's approach towards language being based in, let's say, one's vocation, that the butcher is definitely going to have a different ethic than, let's say, a blacksmith, because their practices are different. One approaches the world differently. If one is hammering something, that's different than if one is slaughtering something. If one is busting something, that's different than one building something. And so now Joel's after my own heart, in that he's kind of trying to take on a diplomatic role, and he's pondering what this is, and he's not opposed to knowing the difference. But the idea, once again, and this is probably, my instinct on conjecture, how I'm speculating this, is that ultimately it's going to come down to a contradictory rub. And so my thesis is that one must allow that and eschew the notion of an overarching truth, and that the real neurosis that's going on, the thing that people can't get away from, is the idea that contradictions themselves need to be embedded, need to be allowed. That the idea of a split spectrum of difference and having grievances that are ongoing and wanting to remediate that's really great. But the allowance of it, let it go, let it flesh out, let it exhaust itself in a spectrum of difference, of discontents. And then when it does come together, some of it will have overlap, some of it will have intersections, and some of it will not, will just clash. And then in those clashing moments within the fractures, that's where we accept the contradiction. And then from there, we try to develop or see how the individuals and or the groups act with post fracture, post contradiction.
And moving beyond that toward metaphysics as a solution, I think that was what metaphysics, if you look at Kant's analysis of how metaphysics came into being in ancient Greece, that is the original purpose of metaphysics, is trying to find some kind of transcendental principle to subordinate all the different disparate conceptions of self-interest, one totalizing conception, in order to mitigate disagreements and arbitrate between disagreements. But this, I think, has become problematized after thousands of years of development, where I don't think metaphysics serves this function properly anymore. It once did. There was an age where it did, and I'm not denying that. But I believe that age has come to an end, and I'll take history, particularly modern history, as evidence for that claim that I've just made. And so, if metaphysics has stopped functioning, I don't believe the solution is more metaphysics. I think the solution is something else, some other way of building a discourse that can produce a consensus in some method, at least arbitrate between different interests. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do. And I don't have all yet, but I think that's the direction that we need to be heading in. And the reason metaphysics has failed taking that, again, referencing generative anthropology, is that I think Gans very astutely identifies metaphysics as the reduction of moral discourse purely to the declarative mode of speech. And this is problematic, I think, because it cuts off discoursing about ethics and morality from its essential root, which is identified by Gans as the ostensive, in the sense that, as you describe, the object of desire that is a problem for the initial human community that needs to be resolved, is not represented metaphysically or in declarative mode, presented ostensively. It's merely gestured toward, and it has a significance that is not in terms of its realness in some objective sense, but in terms of its sacrality, in terms of its necessity to be deferred toward for the benefit of the group. And I think bringing these subterranean modes of language back into discourse translates to recognizing we live in a society which has particular kind of scarce resources that different groups want access. Everyone can't get 100% of what they want, and so there needs to be some level of deferral by these groups toward the others, so that they don't end up competing over them and destroying society as a result. Let's identify what they are. Let's confer upon sacral status, and then let's try and creatively work out how can we develop a kind of discourse that.
So all these musicians want to be musicians. They all want some stage time. Maybe they all want to play at Coachella today, right? Let's get into a discourse and figure out the way in which all of them can have some stage time, but maybe not, right? Like, once again, at this point, I'm like, okay, the guy, now it's a matter of yearning, like the notion of indicating what it is. Okay, well, let's say they're musicians. They want stage time at Coachella, right? Well, we can't give you that. It's kind of like the presidential debates in the States. Like, oh, you can't be on the first stage, where you can only be on the second panel of debaters, like the 2016 Republican lineup. Like, oh, let's put the B team down here, and we'll put the A team up here, and that somehow that is an acceptable thing. And in a way, it's almost as if the utopian of non-bitching, non-complaining, that this guy, Joel, I mean, his desires are great as an ideal, but I cannot possibly imagine that he's not, like, the one thing he's not, or neither of these guys, I mean, they want truth, but they want some sort of civility, and they presume that a discontentment isn't going to arise. I mean, as if Bernie Sanders came in and college for all and any as often as they want, and all the money for health care wouldn't, in its idealism being performed, not have some sort of discontent conjured up on people, the free market capitalists on the right, feeling as if their labor their capitalistic labors or their paradigm of what a society is like would not be undermined by that. And it's also domestic and not global, so it's interesting.
Distribute these resources in a way that is at least minimally satisfying enough to everyone to produce a communal peace. And this is something that we're not going to, if we constitute society in a particular way to mitigate the peace now, that doesn't mean that particular constitution is going to keep working forever. It is very likely that there's going, as there has been, that we're going to need to continually revise this process. And I think metaphysics was one revision. And then, okay, so we've got this perfect way of differentiating, or at least ideology, we've differentiated the resources in the perfect way. We come with liberalism, for example. Give everybody individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and then however the resources are distributed. That's fair. And that's it. Problem solved. But the problem wasn't solved, otherwise you wouldn't have the emergence of socialism and Marxism and fascism and all these other ideologies. These ideologies are evidence that it doesn't work, that it's dysfunctional. And so essentially what I mean by post-metaphysical or post-ideological discourse is factoring that kind of social change will occur, and so we need a discourse that can change with changing circumstances, that can be revised and updated as we go, rather than trying to work out some kind of absolute parameters that might work for now, but very likely will become problems later.
Mm-hmm. So, once again, I wanted to refer just for this distinction that I'd like to make between this variety of metaphysics that you've referenced several times, which does lead to like a rigidity and being trapped in the declarative mode, and then what I take to be a primary kind of metaphysics, which is closer to psychology. It's just dealing with the basic ingredients of desire, intention, incentive as they occur to us, and it's exactly the same project that I think you're getting at in saying that what we need is a mode of dialogue that brings these divergent interests out into the open. And we need to step away from these kind of abstract goals that really just prevent people from coming to like mutually beneficial agreements because they're each trapped in their own position. But again, I wouldn't get rid of this kind of primary metaphysical process, which, like to give an analogy to the circumstance of the originary scene, in the same way that the kind of originary deferment occurs with the introduction of the sign, we can engage in this kind of deferment of our own desire or will by a transformation or a transduction of that emotional information into more of language. So if we view declarative language regarding our intentionality as a kind of therapeutic measure and a way of primary emotional reality, it can have a lot of benefit. I mean, if you
Well, so now Eric's into this. Once again, the level of sophistication required to, like, if you're working with butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, not to have that alliteration, but that the idea that one is going to look at what it is they're saying, their words, and then say, oh, well, it's a sign for the object of my desire, even though I'm actually talking about that empirical unit over there that I desire, that he desires, but I was here first and I still want the damn thing. I don't want to I don't want to remediate my desire and then somehow fold on to some sort of philosophical reapproach to my words. I mean, essentially, that just means, hey, I'm backing down. Okay, I'm willing to break the bread and share it with you, or whatever X is in one case. And so basically, it's just kind of comes down to the pragmatics of negotiation. So I'm not certain that these guys are doing anything other than what a lot of philosophy does do, which is flood that which is easy, day-to-day, and mundane with $10 words and sophistication to just kind of come down on it. Not that I mean, I think that the history and having a knowledge of language and a knowledge of oneself relative to one's language and one's community and one's politic is beautiful. I mean, that's the beauty of philosophy. But these guys are trying to talk about a societal thing and reach it, either through psychology, sociology, or a history of philosophy. And I think that it's going to suffice as a type of talking head, like, yes, we can, like some sort of philosophical consensus on how to approach politics that then the politicians wouldn't quite agree with, or the psychologists would have their own little, well, let's kind of reapproach it like this negotiation.
Or just been in a conversation with someone, and and got to the point where one of you was getting irritated, but instead of voicing from the position of that emotional incentive your act in a functional way to bring about the emotional end that you desire, you instead switch to a kind of descriptive mode and drive exactly like this is the state of intentionality that's occurring for me, and try to keep that at the declarative level. I think that's a mode of private discourse that is useful for those who want to cooperate in a direct political sense. Otherwise, I see that the basic danger is, since this ultimately has to resort to an appeal to the will and appeal desires are, any cooperation will be predicated on an alignment of that basic desire. And so the question, the metaphysical question, I would say, and ethical question, they can't really be differentiated at that point, is how do we bring about an alignment of desire in the group that seeks to create a mediating dialogue at a broader social level. And so for those of us who are interested in creating this kind of dialogue to open up this space of cooperation, we do need to look at the questions that the metaphysics of the self address, the kind of deep psychological questions, and apply it in our interaction with one another. I would.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong, and that the next the next thing with global communities of philosophers that are sophisticated at this level might be, so to say, partitioned away from the group and allowed to get together as a community and come up with policy. I mean, there's meaning at length and like long drawn out, very deep, very sophisticated negotiations and conversations. And then what? And then what? Then we contract it. Then we do put it into language, or we just come to, well, we're going to allow global behavioral policy to be based on a nod and a handshake. And then you come down back to the difference with the graphemine and the notion of contract, and then you're back somewhat to the same problem about how do we interpret the contract, who are the ongoing bodies in that are reinterpreting the contract. And then once again, it seems as if it's just kind of like the younger generation of philosophers attempting to do roughly what Western society has been doing, at least for the last couple hundred years, in terms of how to state law structure and policy for people's behavior and develop a rule. Now, I just think because it's global, it's not that we actually have solutions right now because of still problems with histories and traditions and language distinctions, huge cultural differences will run clash. So this appears to be an intra-domestic sort of dialogue that's going here. Oh, by the way, speaking of bakers that turned philosophers, we got someone, Barklord, telling me, "Oh, Foucault died way back when," because I didn't know if he was kicking in some nursing home somewhere or not. I thought he might have lasted longer than Derrida did here on the planet. Okay.
But did you want to address at all in any deeper way what your specific intentions are as far as like creating this kind of dialogue? I've listed a number of people, actually several, probably 15 or so, have signed up for it, and we're going to have conversations. And I'll just start like that with my channel. I've had projects in the past, like my Academy project I did with Kenneth Brown channel on YouTube. We did the Perennial podcast together. And that was productive. I left a video on my Join Our Experimental Organization, which kind of describes how that worked and the kind of nitty-gritty of what organizational structure does, the functions are that need to be performed, and then how to create proper incentives to maintain that system into the future. Like, those are really the interesting questions to me at a practical level. So I have my email list. We're just going to start with one-on-one conversations scheduled on a rotating basis, just to kind of familiarize ourselves with one another at a pre-ideological way. But what did you basically have in mind? Whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to discuss that, but I want to go back to what you just said, because I have something in response to what you were talking about just before that. When you kind of, I think, very astutely recognized that really what we're doing is, like, ultimately this is a question of desire and will. We have, and I think the question is not how do we get everything that we want, but I think how do we recognize that desire can't coexist with society. That there's, in order to have social being, which is immensely valuable. We all have some mode of identification with something like a community or society or civilizational form larger than ourselves. There are certain things that you can't also have. And I'm not going to harp on this kind of, joker, we live in a society meme, but really what this is about is identifying what desires are compatible and what's incompatible with society and setting those limits. And the reason why I'm saying this is post-ideological is because I believe have to be living, fluid, and transformational, and rather than static and absolute. And I think that's really the key. I mean, I don't think that we disagree too much on that. I think that's the real key point to emphasize is that, and people accuse me of relativism. I guess that is relativism, but it's not relativized to, it's relativized to the perpetuation of society, and there's a lot of contingencies, not just material contingencies and ecosystemic contingencies. Also, we can analyze society and see these kind of structures that constantly kind of repeat and reemerge and perpetuate themselves. And so I do believe that there are structures we can identify that also act as.
So, once again, I like where the JoelDavis is coming from in this, and that he is making kind of a critique about structures, but that he wants to denote kind of a preference for that which is dynamic and in verbose form, that which is changing, but not losing sight on where things can ground. It's just that if they do ground, don't be post-ideologic, right? Meaning that his preference for the in-group of people having these dialogues, I think, would be people that are more mutable. They like to ponder and consider as opposed to land on, because once one lands on some sort of agreement, then at that point they can reinvest in whatever the new ideologic function is at that time. And it seems as if he's trying to keep a constant backpedal going here. And I like that's where I come in, meaning that's how it is I agree and comport with an ideology of keeping things in flux and in a type of consideration, as opposed to but not in denial of other people having these ideologies. That's if he thinks that there is this post-ideologic community, then that to me, I haven't seen. That sounds like some sort of future sci-fi movie to me that would be interesting, in fact, if that did manifest. But at that point, if there's not some sort of strict groundedness, meaning we'd almost have to rip out historians out of society. We just have to kill them, or we'd have to kill policymakers or anyone that was trying to necessarily ground or posit certain strains or strands or ideologic fibers through the body politic. And yet he's not saying that. That's my critique. It's more like how to outline what the strands are of the stem of the body politic, as if the body politic is some sort of tree now. But
contingencies like class distinctions or gender norms, or kind of cultural ideas of politeness, rudeness, and so forth. I don't think these things are all just entirely just on a whim. They all have very clear teleologies, very clear functions and purposes when you think in a holistic sense. And so that's what I want to do, is kind of construct or aid the construction of science, of how to understand these kind of contingent parameters, and therefore apply them to an analysis of society as it is, and then we can identify what desires are becoming problematic, where is the potential for the breakdown of society, identify those desires, and then by fixing on them and recognizing them as a problem, only from there can some kind of creative solution be generated, and that would be whatever kind of moral innovations would constitute the future.
So well, and I'm wondering what he's going to say here, because now he's back to some sort of the notion of a ground, a reapproach to something constitutive. But what it is he does, like his value set is some sort of a maintenance of society, right? A cohesion of society as his ideology has made, so we're not in some sort of primitivistic, anarchical state. So I'm sensing from him that his desire is to maintain something that's familiar to him in terms of what he's describing as a society, and he's not. He's still approaching things from a diplomatic point of view, but his own root is still yearning for something like a familiar society that he's talking about. Not saying you couldn't project a sci-fi on that, but
Before we go on, let's go back to the organizational question a little bit later, because this kind of brought to mind an issue. So you're saying basically we have to identify what kinds of intentional states, dispositions of will are incompatible with this functional adaptation as a group to the environment at large and to one another. To one another. And so what I'm wondering is how much is there a slippery slope in that regard where you might cut off certain behaviors that are explicitly incompatible, and that would be fine. But what if there were behaviors that you couldn't identify on the basis of this kind of pragmatism, or at least not immediately, that you might be able to highlight with more of a traditional disposition, or they would make sense in light of some kind of like theory of the will in that sense, and so that the metaphysics might be indispensable for identifying those slippery slope moments. I'll give a concreteness right now by saying, like, there's kind of a prisoner's dilemma with regard to the sexual marketplace. For those who aren't familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, is you have two prisoners who have to press a button to shock the other person, or like if they shocked, if no one presses a button, no one will get shocked. And so like the best case scenario is no one presses the button, but the kind of perverse incentive for each prisoner is to press the button and make sure that they don't themselves get shocked. And so in the sexual marketplace, no one pushing the button would be no males engaging in this kind of overt sexual conduct explicitly, creating this kind of sexualized environment in public, that you would have etiquette and you would make sure you behave in a very platonic way with your female coworkers or anyone who you're not actively and explicitly courting. Like that's the way it wasn't always explicitly that way in Western society. In actuality, I mean, it was supposed to be that way, right? You announced your intentions when you went to court someone, or when you were married, you didn't commit so much adultery as there is today, and especially this kind of like micro.
And I like that he's using this as an example. It's not the example that would have come to my mind. Holographic principle of telepathy or not, I wouldn't have come up with that. But I'm glad he is, because once again, this is the pushback. It's the difference between the dynamic of the wave and the solidity of the shore. And so Eric's once again reinstalling an idea of, hey, at one point within this kind of lacked up sentiment of sand on the shore, can we not look at, let's say, a stratification through the stand back here when the water was hitting it and reapply it here, in the current, and re-engage a standard or traditional metaphysic. So once again, he's off here, and so it's nice. And by the way, I did see this to me is what's not understood about Derrida, is that Derrida, for the most part, and I'm just throwing this out as a tangential side note, he is taking on my position relative to the discourse he's seeing amongst the history of certain philosophers. And granted, he's the one that's making the comparison, but normally they're contemporaneous philosophers of the past that he's noting their letters or their relationship or how they functioned between each other, and then he's making his own. He'll pull a discursive move there, and then he'll present his own, inject his own philosophical or literary descriptions about what's going on.
Level displays of sexual intention that does happen. So that's pressing, engaging that behavior, because when you do that and no one else is, you stand out in the sexual marketplace. Now, what happens, though, to the commons at the sexual level if everyone starts amping that up just a little bit? Like one person engages and disrupts the commons, it increases the cost for everyone else to compete. Everyone has to exhibit that same level of sexual behavior. And this carries on until basically social etiquette has disappeared. It's like, man is a wolf to man in the sexual marketplace. Everyone is competing, and I think we're approaching that level, actually. But how would you make sense of this, or how would you identify that as a problem for society if you didn't already kind of
It's so weird for him to say, I think we're approaching that. To me, that's a type of naivety that under any societal condition where you'd say a we, where you're saying the we, maybe Eric is referencing the globe as a whole, or but if you take an industrial American society or city, that's you could still find this dynamic of who's on the outside, who's comporting, what are the variations, and what is the amplification from certain historic mating strategies relative to whatever the political and cultural ethos is. But there's a whole history of rapists anyway. But anyway, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent.
understand like the basic perennialist precepts regarding the will, like desire begets desire. The more we can defer desire, the more we can defer gratification, the more balanced we'll be. The more balanced we'll be, the more truthful we'll be. The more truthful we are, the more we'll harmonize with the nature of things, and therefore society will carry on. So how do you identify that kind of problem as something incompatible with social cooperation?
Okay, well, I think it's pretty obvious that like unfettered sexuality has negative consequences for some, particularly with looking at like Pareto distributions. If 20% of the guys are fucking 80% of the girls, and 20% of those guys are fucking 80% of that 80%, you're going to end up having a lot of pissed off and resenting incel dudes who just might burn your civilization down. And I think we're kind of starting to see that express itself in the political system right now, as in response to feminism.
One thing I think is interesting also, having gone to the Ukraine and figuring out about the characters on their dollar bills, that a feminist poet is on their dollar bill. I'm trying to remember what her name is. But and I once knew, and she's over 100 years, a feminist from over 100 years ago that is now brought to everyone's attention. And one could then say modern Ukraine's communist society a century later is the result of society raising up a feminist philosophy at that time. And I'm more than capable. I just made that articulation there. So anyway, my point being that these guys are trying to like repackage something that's already dynamically happened. Here I'm not preferencing Joel's response too much, but
I mean, I don't really, I don't see, like, I believe you're kind of using this kind of consequentialist analysis to, as a way of like, to determine that that's not a great unfitting sexual norms. But at the same time, really extreme sexual norms, really extreme regulation of the sexual market also seems to have create a lot of resentment and potentially negative outcomes. If you look at some of the problems having in the Islamic world, for example, I think you see that. So I don't believe it's this absolute of the more desires that you kind of make unacceptable, the better, because there's a trade-off. Every desire that you discipline produces this kind of residual resentment in the people that are being disciplined. And if that level of resentment raises too high, that
okay, I'll let him finish.
There's also a threat to the social order. So I think the key is balance, and I think the way that you understand what works and what doesn't work has to be through some kind of trial and error, some kind of empirical studies. Like, of course, we can understand from tradition this is the way it was done in the past. It seemed to work better then. Maybe we should replicate that now, and I subscribe to that idea in a lot of ways. But there's also, I think it's natural for us to want to experiment and trial things in order to get better knowledge. And so, I mean, I don't know like exactly what you're asking me, like to come up with like my personal opinion for you, or
see, I mean, I think Eric elaborated specifically on this point to show that a dynamic of human relationships within a sexual situation, like this guy's saying like, oh, if all these guys are getting the girl because they amped up, and that he wants to argue some Pareto distribution. But nonetheless, the analysis of the context of that moment where one man takes a woman, or has, the woman's not complicit in that dynamic of being chased, it causes this. I mean, the guy's discontent here, Joel's discontent, is like, oh well, to have that kind of a behavior would be undesirable for society. So in one way, that's outside of the purview. But Eric's point, though, should have been abstracted at this point across multiple examples, and maybe he'll throw another example out. Let's see if he does, because this could be anything about, oh, man spreading. Hey, these guys need more space in the playground, a finite playground, in order to perform a particular game, right? Oh, we have one field and these guys want to play on it in its entirety, and yet some of these girls want to play badminton in the corner or something like that, right? There has to be some sort of I don't know. Meaning, I don't think the guy is in fact picking up, and he admits he's not picking up what Eric's laying down here in terms of like an actual account of a dynamic that would require a stepping, a more of a traditional approach, instead of just like a descriptive stepping back, where the individual doing the descriptive stepping back doesn't have time to do the too much stepping back because he's in the play for a woman, or she's in being pursued by multiple men or something like that.
This is what the rule should be, because I don't really, I'm not an expert in that particular field, and I can give you the rough outline of we don't want resentment to get too large to the point that it's the social order, and we don't want desire to get too out of control that it threatens the social order, and so we need to find some kind of happy medium.
We don't want desire to get out of control, right? So all of a sudden, then, this is a preference for what I said he was going to appeal to, which was some sort of his own preference of what a civil society looked like. So he might, he sounds like he's a Brit. He's probably got some sort of cardinal or classic approach to civilization or Western civilization as he's inherited it. So anything that it seems like some sort of brute bar force is necessarily, he's going to say, well, upon reanalysis, that's too far of the fringe. But where Eric was coming in is, no, these are actual natural happenings. And then his pushback, Joel's pushback, was, oh, well, then we have to analyze it as a Pareto distribution and figure out some sort of diminishment practice.
And I think the kind of monogamous gender norms that are kind of still normal in society, maybe we've gone a little bit too far in one direction, you could argue, but that returning to monogamous ideal is probably the best solution that we've come up with as a social technology to respond to the potential for sexuality to derail.
Like drones that watch guys at bars hitting on chicks. Like, hey man, that guy flirted with you too much because he made you smile. But that one, he's flexing from a distance. And oh, I see you looking at that third one over there because of X, Y, or Z reason. Oh, we need drones, we need cameras, we need police, we need remediation, we need coordinators there. Like I said, so the Joel, as much as he's favoring on the left, he's failing to pick up, and or the conclusion of what he's going for is a kind of a leftist or a classical or some sort of control mechanism trying to re-relegate back to what we consider a general notion of acceptable society amongst these two Caucasian young men living in the West.
Social stability, but I mean, beyond the actual exactitudes of that, I'm not an expert in, to be honest.
What I was mostly getting at is that there's an attitude to the problem which inherently dealing with the metaphysics of desire or will. And on that basis, since we're saying there is this real thing in the world, this desire has a substantial being independent of how we understand it. And if we build this kind of model of what the will is, how it behaves, then we can look at seemingly innocuous social practices that would conflict with down the line cooperation without having to run the experiment, because it's kind of, you're dealing with a priori justifications for certain forms of prescription, and that's one of the big advantages of a metaphysical.
And not exactly what Eric said, and it's relegated to the individual. I mean, you can describe it outward, but you can point to any example of any dynamic group interaction and say, oh yeah, the individual is appealing to kind of an a priori re-standardization of this
orientation. Whereas if it's this kind of empiricist, pragmatist kind of approach, I know that GA and formalism account for this. You're going to ultimately need a decider, somebody to make decisions regarding these things, and they can operate on the basis of all sorts of studies and what has been observed. But then you run into the problem of like black swan events, and the ancient heuristics might end up being much more reliable because they've survived, and the models that people are building of these various dynamics might themselves be, people building the models might be interested actors. Maybe they're representative of a group that has a particular competitive advantage in one kind of, sexual strategy, and so then they'll try to put out information compatible with that, so that you still get the war regarding this space. And because it's a matter of what allows people to cooperate and how we can pragmatically assess that, the struggle is just constant. You're always going to have the struggle over that, unless, in my view, everyone in a society agrees to refer to these kind of a priori metaphysical notions regarding will, and then we can derive and not just
see. And so he's going to say, and that's appeal, a priori relationship to will, and to me, it's an operative deontologic rule system that one would appeal to. It's something like a code of conduct, but even that is going to have its gradients down to, oh, the bigger guy has a lower voice. Are we going to have to put some sort of mechanism on so that the woman hears all men's tone quality at the same level, such as to make an egalitarian thing? So there is now, and I imagine that they're going to have to move into some sort of discussion about an egalitarian politic or society here. Let's see if they do.
Just inductively arrive at, sound modes of conduct. But I wouldn't, discourage this kind of empiricist, pragmatist approach. I would say that you need to start bottom and the top. But I think we've gone on about this enough. I'll let you, respond with what you want to respond with there, and then maybe we can move on to the question of organization.
Yeah, so it's really unpragmatic to just throw out all of like tradition and ways of being handed down by various metaphysical and religious traditions, because clearly, like, we can look back at history and see that they worked to a degree. And so I'm not saying let's throw everything out and start from scratch and build everything up from like zero knowledge. But the way that we assess whether ideas are working or not is we have to have some kind of parameters for measuring it. Otherwise, if you're saying, hey, if we use it's like the kind of social norms of 15th century Catholic Europe, those are the best social norms we should be using. And then I would say why, and I guarantee that if you would then have all these reasons, or because it does this, it does that, and so forth. And so that's what I'm trying to ground the discoursing is the actual bolts of how things work. God said so, or because this is the tradition. So, if you have a physical argument that works, the actual social process, not the truth of the claim, but the actual social process of using knowledge and applying knowledge and imposing it over others and agreeing to it as a community in this kind of pragmatic mentality. Because if you have this really great metaphysical argument for these should be the social norms, and we try it out and all these problems start happening, I'm not going to be convinced of your metaphysical argument so much as to continue with it. I'm going to say, hey, this is your argument, but it's not working, so it's clearly wrong. And that's what my mentality is. I don't really care how you get to the conclusion. I just want the conclusion to work. And I think we can be creative in how we get to conclusions. There's all these different.
See, and now I like what he's saying now, once again, because he's now in a way he's underscoring metaphysics itself, like the standard, right? And he's already basically reiterated, because my feeling was that I was predicting he's got his back to the ropes, and so he does have to acquiesce to tradition, and so they're back to there, and he's quoting some that particular time zone of this particular era of Europe. But he basically, it sounds like he's going to have an antithesis towards traditions of metaphysics, and that's where his dialogue's going here.
Different ways, and we should use all the different ways to get to conclusions insofar as they work. And ultimately, the idea that I think you almost kind of alluded to this idea that we need individuals to make decisions. If we don't have metaphysics, or if we have metaphysics, individuals still have to make decisions upon which metaphysical system to use, how to apply it, and how to interpret it, and so forth. So you can never get around this problem of, at some point, someone has to make a decision in authority on which way we go with how we institutionalize it.
Boom. Okay, so now they're landed on the same page right there, right? Eric earlier said there would have to be some sort of authority, and now he's agreeing there has to be some sort of authority. Boom. So they've hit that, right? My book, my book on embedded contradiction on the mikefehl.com site, MIKEFAHL.com. You can scroll down and you can see the embedded contradiction. It argues contradiction in lieu of an authority, such that one is always maintained, or when one runs into something that cannot be fettered out, the conclusion, then either you have the thrash of the contradiction, but then ultimately on stepping back out, you would not have, or it would be an absence or in lieu of a final authority. So it's interesting that these two guys have come to that. Let's see now if they recognize that they're agreeing.
Disciplined society, and I don't think there's any way around that problem. It just has to be accepted.
I think that's right. That's right.
Okay.
So I agree, and it's a tool, formula, art to be just trusted. Absolutely. But so let's just put you in charge as the sovereign right now and say you have to come up with metrics to determine what works. So how do you build an organizational structure with that in mind? How do we test perpetually for functional social behavior? I know I've made reference to hollow chain, social credit currencies, things of that nature. I don't think either of us are technical experts in this, but what technologies would you want to use, and how would you measure those things?
Okay, so ultimately what I would think an aspect of the project that I'll be engaging in is basically de-ideologizing the social sciences and attempting to kind of reconstruct them in light of the kind of epistemological worldview that I have and that I share with other people in my kind of network and community of thinkers. And so ultimately, I think you need all the different disciplines. So you need historical analysis, you need economics, you need sociology, you need psychology, and you need political science, etc. In order to inform decision making. And that's kind of what already is occurring right now. We live almost pretty much under a technocracy where a bunch of economic experts make economic policy and sociological experts generally design social policy and so forth. And I think just the problem with that is ultimately the ideological justifications. Ideological presuppositions and then justify under the illusion of science a bunch of their outcomes. And I think we've got a bit of a context here of trying to step kind of outside of that. The individual actor is always going to have their own incentives and their own biases, but at least articulating them and making them okay, so from this perspective, this is the conclusion, this perspective, this is the conclusion, and you as sovereign or you as leader are going to have to take into consideration all these different perspectives and mediate between them. And insofar as you do a good job, you'll probably keep your power because, I mean, that's you're keeping everyone happy by definition of doing that. In terms of
nothing new under the sun. Same problem, different era. Same problem, different generation. Same problem. Two smart dudes coming at it from the same angle, and it comes down to an authority, a group, an analysis, and a policy, and then the implementation of policy. Seems like it's kind of.
I think if you look at great political leaders in history, great business leaders in history, great religious leaders in history, if you want to be a political leader, business leader, religious leader, it makes sense to look back upon figures of history that you admire and try and reappropriate the kind of ideas and structures that they used. And so me as an individual, I would try and synthesize all these different forms of knowledge to, if I was given the responsibility to make decisions as best I could.
So just like any other politician, let me, with good intent, let me make the best decision with the information I have.
I think as possible of the kind of social organism as this constellation of perspectives, and grounding not perspectives in terms of this right and wrong binary, but in terms of this multi-perspectival kind of ecosystem of ideas, like recognizing ideas as like the fabric of society, that is these living expressions of different flows of desire and resentment in this kind of very Nietzschean way, I think is probably a lot more conducive to making wise choices than just bunkering down with a particular interest group and a particular set of ideological presuppositions and a particular kind of narrow worldview informed by only one particular approach to knowledge. And so I guess that would be kind of the general gist of the kind of governance that I think would be most effective and that I'd like to see. And my argument for that is grounded in not just this is the good, insofar as governing like this makes you a virtuous person. I think it's a more pragmatic in the sense that governing like this is likely to be a good idea if you're governing, because the whole point of it is keeping as many people as happy and as peaceful and cooperative as possible. And so by extension, by doing so, your power becomes more stable and you gain more respect. And obviously there's a lot of personal benefits to receive from that. And I think trying to figure out ways to engineer ourselves out of some kind of distinction between self-interest and social interest in such a way that we can warp incentives, or warp's wrong way, but re-engineer incentives so that people who are doing good work for the social totality, for benefiting as individuals, is the kind of path that we need to be taking if we want to get things to improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the idea behind us.
The only thing I heard him say was technological, right? Like somehow you might have like an earbud in and then you would try to make the best decision, and then technologically you might be fed like, oh, you didn't consider this, so X program in this tech is going to do it. And then it's like, okay, take the oldest, Homo sapien with our rational capability and bring them to present and grant them the same thing under a community. I don't know. Here we go. Let's see what Eric's going to say.
Social credit-based currency is that you take stock of the impact someone is having in their community and then remunerate them accordingly. So I did something like this with the academy structure. I had in mind to have like a system of voting essentially that was weighted on the basis of how you yourself were evaluated by a voting process. So it wouldn't just be a purely democratic form of social credit, but it would be a little bit more aristocratic, where the people who are esteemed to be null, their opinions are taken more into account and then influence more how others are considered. So, I mean, as far as like immediate first steps, I know you're more inclined probably to operate behind the scenes than I am. I tend just to talk about whatever I have in mind to do.
Great. So then it would come down to those who acquire the status of doctor, or those who get some sort of social headway, would have greater standing on a voting thing. And the irony of what Eric is saying now is, earlier on he was talking about how words function as the sign, as a stand-in for the object that they're representing. Well, neato, but that's the same problem with voting at all, right? The very act of voting can dissuade or persuade other voters on how to consider what the value of one's input is. And this notion of being able to do some sort of direct, immediate calculation, I mean, maybe that's another high-tech thing, like, oh, well, this whole community is or isn't digging what X person is saying or doing, therefore let's, then it's, maybe it should just come down to programming and then adding contingent variables in the programming to analyze us, and that it's not going to be based on human community of living and dying others. Otherwise, I really don't see how what it is they're saying is much different than just a discourse of how groups and historically have attempted to solve problems and figure out what one's input is and what their value is to said X boundaried community, with the community influx and in growth and with different variations of individuals coming in. But let me let them speak more.
YouTube channel. But what do you do in these first first steps to begin arriving at that kind of intersubjective social evaluation and like rewarding people in what sense? Like, where does this process start? Like, when does it begin to happen that people acquire these kind of social credit points?
Yeah, also there's approaches. So, I mean, I really like what the holochain guys are doing with this idea of constructing these kind of reputational currencies that factor in kind of moral valuations into the distribution of economic value, and that they are kind of these social valuation mechanisms rather than individual valuation mechanisms as conducted by like the exchange of like prices, exchange of money between individuals. And I think in terms of economics, that's a good approach. And it's a decentralized. It's just up to entrepreneurs to come up with forms of economic value that can be brought into these kind of technologically mediated scenes and then traded into the ecosystem for access to economic nodes within the ecosystem. So I think insofar as the holochain guys succeed, it will just be a matter of finding a good amount of entrepreneurial projects and emerging business ideas that can account for the largest amount of economic consumption and production possible to sustain the individuals within those kind of economic ecosystems. And then once that's established and people can kind of live self-sufficient in this kind of reputational network as opposed to the main economic exchange network mediated by like fiat currency, then it'll become very attractive for other people, just normal everyday people doing normal everyday people jobs. It'll be much easier to integrate them into the system.
So it's interesting because earlier on he was at least throwing out the term at the beginning of their conversation concerning communism as if that was a fair thing. Now his preference, and I'm not saying he doesn't have good, that he's not running contra to that, but he's favoring obviously kind of a continuance of where technology is going. And it sounds like he's preferring something like a blockchain credit score system based on other individuals that share within that the coinage. Like, oh, hey, we got this video game and we have a few unknown anonymous players in here who aren't performing the way we want, and we've already marked them down saying, God, we really don't prefer playing with them. And yet other individuals might, outside of the group might think otherwise, like I'm maybe on a different blockchain. So it is interesting to hear where he's summing it up. But
as for the political, ultimately I think it boils down to the fact that there are powerful actors in the world who wield the power to make change, and for people like me or you or 99.999% of us, trying to challenge them directly is kind of stupid. Either you just don't have the means to even surmount a significant challenge for them to take notice of you. But if you do, they've got resources to defend themselves against your attack on their power, and the amount of resources necessary to like revolt against the global power structure is virtually impossible because they'll snuff you out and prevent you. And so the solution has to look something like helping the people who are running the world, finding some way of benefiting them, and insofar as you benefit them, making it possible for them to interact with society and at large in a way that produces seemingly positive ends that create more social stability, that mitigate limits in society, that improve our relationship to the environment, that improve our, that preserve the kind of essential aesthetic features of our civilization that I don't want to see eroded. And I think to do that, it means we have to provide, I think for people like me and you, we have to kind of develop conceptual technologies, theoretical technologies that kind of emerge out of the ideas that we've just discussed, and present them in a package that can be attractive to elites. That the current systems that they're using to run the world have identifying the problems that they have and how they might work in the short term, but in the long term that they can have some serious repercussions, and showing how using an alternative set of conceptual technologies that we offer could help them kind of secure their power long term. And in order to do so, kind of transcending this kind of ideological warfare and looking to what policy decisions
See now, right there, he's not transcending his ideological. He is now taking the current status quo, a current perception of what he thinks is best in the paradigm, and then furthering it.
Traditional decisions that are more conducive to a stable and symbiotic society need to be taken. I think in a world of 7 billion people, actually doing a good job of running society in a way that the majority of people living within it generally benefit from your decisions is a no-brainer. I think it's a far more viable strategy for being successful and being antagonistic toward the interests of the general population and toward the general stable functioning of the general population. I think.
See, and this is kind of a monoculture that he's prescribing as kind of a projection of how he would want the future to be. And I just think it's he's, you know, when it's convenient, reduce the optic or globalize the optic, and then come to some sort of general you know, he thinks he's post-ideological, but in fact, he's just going to reiterate an old ideology, a very conservative ideology, and then make arguments towards it. So this is where the paradox and the kind of the ironies, the accepting of the ironies, meaning I don't hold it against these two individuals if each you know, if each of them and even myself run into a point where in discussion we've reached a being guilty of our own contradiction or a breach or a selfishness or an adherence, kind of a wanting to move forward but a retaining oneself back. But basically, I think the guy is slowly, like an Ouroboros, eating his own tail, and I think at some point we all kind of do that. But
what we see right now in the political sphere is elite actors defending themselves against ideological actors and then the kind of blowback or the collateral damage of that is the everyday person. The everyday person isn't really involved or responsible, but they just kind of blowback from these kind of inter-ideological, inter-political faction disputes. And so,
see, they require a sophistication at the end, and now he's going to refer to the day-to-day. Why didn't he refer to the day-to-day back then? Because it wouldn't have shored up what it is he was trying to promote.
Ultimately, I think what we need to do is figure out a way to provide technologies that enable the elites in our society to form alliances with one another that are more stable, that are more functional, and so that there's less incentive to focus on fighting one another and more incentive on them to focus on productive cooperation. And so the project that I want to kind of launch, and I've already got some people interested in talking to me, is to recruit interested people who kind of agree with my general spiritual and political vision, like the kind of epistemological direction that I'm heading in broadly, and you know, want to participate in forming some kind of original organization.
And why is he saying epistemological direction? It's his whole metaphysical direction. It's his whole ideological. Like he's shuffling out the word epistemological with ideological to make certain he's not part of the encampment he was eschewing earlier about those who retain rigid ideologies. Now he's like, oh, I've already got people interested in me for this particular ideological function. He just sounds like someone that's trying to promote a new Bitcoin or a new blockchain tech that is kind of, find people of your persuasion, right? But let's see. I mean, maybe this whole thing is one big sales, hour and a half sales pitch to each other. I mean, I don't put it past Eric. I mean, he's been looking for like-minded individuals and kind of falling into the process of finding individuals for some time now.
Once that organizational structure is in place and we acquaint ourselves with one another and clarify a kind of manifesto or system of principles from which to work from, then we have kind of consensus, or at least a kind of delegated structure of authority that can then put individuals that kind of enable those individuals to go in the direction that they're passionate in, to go and reconstitute and redevelop and research and develop the various kind of politically relevant disciplines and produce also just kind of political analysis, geopolitical analysis of hot button political issues in light of these theoretical developments that can provide the kind of information that produces this consciousness in elites. I was suggesting, and I believe that if we can provide a service to elites in the sense that give them a way of thinking about what they're doing that helps them be more successful in what they're doing, build more stable alliances with one another, build more stable alliances and relationships with society at large.
So he's admitting he's lower on the totem pole, and his whole idea, help those in power, and then get a good payoff for it, right? So basically, he's one of the sellouts instead of one of the revolutionary rebellion types, and that's fine because that's is as avant-garde as he believes his philosophical approach is. It's really that he I don't know. Okay.
If you help people that are very powerful, they help you in return because they want you to keep producing material, they want you to keep providing analysis to keep continually informing their decisions. And so I guess the long-term goal is to turn that institute into not just a journal that produces kind of written materials, but also maybe like a think tank that can pay its own stuff, that can just spend their time researching and developing politically relevant and translating it into politically relevant prescriptions to help inform political active. The kind of overarching goal. So, if anybody who's watching this and got any kind of point of contact with me, you can go. I have a Twitter account which you can go to, and you can just message me.
How to sell out and how to make a buck, how to do what every other guy that's already sucked it up in the civilization that just wants something new and kind of repackage it with some fancy $10 words and a little bit of horse shit in order to suck it up and not give it to the man, but give the man what the man wants, and then carry on. And I mean, I'm not going to fault him for it. I think it's really interesting that that's how he's going to sidestep and smear this thing. But fucking whatever. It doesn't matter, man. I just saw some new dude, and for the first few minutes, I saw Eric shooting shit with them, and I thought, oh yeah, okay, it's kind of interesting. I'll just do a critique video. But now I realize it is a sales pitch. But maybe that's all humanity ever had, was try to see it my way, and if you do, then let's make some fucking money, blah, 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 blah.
And I'll try and make time to set up an interview with you. We can discuss your talents, your research background, whether you're the right kind of what we're doing. And if you're kind of interested in what kind of output will end up coming out of this process, then I guess stay tuned. Ultimately, we're producing output. Hopefully, if everything goes well, then you can kind of read for yourself. And my YouTube channel is kind of like the videos that I'm making are kind of going to have been and are going to continue to be kind of rough sketches of the kind of general context for thinking that I think is necessary for an institution like this to kind of formulate its identity and its intentionality and focus from. That's kind of basically my project. I guess it's not just my project. I recognize that as an I don't have the capacity to do all the research and produce all the output that is necessary, kind of narcissistic. And so that's why I want to develop an organization of people who share my vision so we can work together and thereby increase our output capacity. But I think ultimately it will take, at least in its original construction, the form of just basically a journal, an online journal of sorts that is explicitly focused upon carving out this kind of what this post-ideological politics could actually look like in a kind of technical and
fuck you, buddy. I mean, post-ideologic. Sorry. I mean, I'm nothing against you personally if you hear that, but fuck that noise, right? Enough saying post-ideologic. You've just reconfounded, you've regrounded your ideology of capital, wealth, production, and so forth, and given us the sales pitch. And now it's almost like you're trying to get a mate and make some fucking money with you, but using the term post-ideological. I think I'm kind of fed up with it, so I'm gonna speed it up a little bit more to get to the end and thank whoever's already listened this far. But
can we confirm something? Would you stand up for a moment? Would that be possible?
Wants to see if he has a
I'm
penis.
wearing like boxer shorts.
No, just so we can see your shirt.
My shirt's got nothing on it. It's just
Oh no. Oh no. The claim was circulating in the chat that you were wearing a minion shirt.
yeah, I wish I owned one. Yeah, but maybe I need to get a bug shirt with the front printed.
Yeah, so I saw one comment that I wanted you to respond to from Rattle Greptron. He said, sounds like this democratic reward system could devolve into just a popularity contest. How would you situate things to avoid that?
I mean, the democratic reward system is what the Holochain guys are doing with their economic project, and ultimately it is a popularity contest. It's a reconstitution of the economics in terms of a popularity contest, I guess you could say. But is popularity a bad to construct economics out of? I'm not sure. It is actually a bad idea because
But is it all that
ultimately, how do you gain popularity in economic context? Surely it's by doing things that are kind of useful to the context. So, in terms of things that I want to do, I think they necessarily have to take on a far more hierarchical structure, just by virtue of the kind of just necessities of human organization. Yeah, but in terms of how it's not so much a business structure. I anticipate it's not really kind of up for debate here. We know what the kind of hierarchical business structures work best. When it comes to the debate conducting the formal businesses and corporations, Holochain is more focused on augmenting the way that value is exchanged from just one-to-one pricing to a more communal and social form of valuation. And it's an interesting experiment. And ultimately, I think, kind of relating to our whole discussion, the kind of by their fruits you shall know them. We'll see how it goes when it actually kind of starts becoming a thing. It's an interesting project. I definitely am keeping.
Okay, and so it's not a sales project. He wants people to get. He wants to advantage it. He wants to forward it. He prefers this, but now he's overlapping it with. Well, it's also kind of an overarching political, kind of maybe a communist ideology, which is fine because now it's like a layered. Now he's got a layered thing, so now he can move back into ambiguation. Now that he's disambiguate, now he can move one pedal over the other and show the shadow of the first going through the second here. So
close tabs on it, and a friend of mine who's far more involved will be coming on my channel and doing an interview, kind of going into that idea deeper. For those who are interested, keep an eye on my next week or so. It should go up.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll definitely check it out. So let me see. There was one other thing I thought that I saw. Well, I wanted to ask, how much have you considered the academic function of this organization that you're looking to establish? So, the hierarchical of business structures is very real, but there's also an aspect of training in business structures. In the modern day, it seems like the most successful, well-run businesses end up training their own employees because it just ends up being more cost-effective to start with a blank slate, and then also you get to train them specifically to the kind of tasks they'll need to perform on your own. So, that's about that training function. What do you have in mind?
Yeah, so once we get the theory in place, it will become obvious, and the people who have developed it will have to create some kind of pedagogical kind of materials where, the best stuff that we come up with gets translated in some kind of lecture series. If there's enough interest, you can convert it into classes of some kind. Ultimately, the vision that I have, which is this is a very early vision, as I'm going to be open to the input of the other members, very much so in kind of formulating this vision through time. But the initial vision that I have is essentially people will train in a particular discipline. So you'll have one guy or a group of guys that specialize in history, or a group of guys that specialize in sociology, or what have you. And they'll learn the discourse in its academic sense by necessity actually doing the actual degrees necessary, and reading all the kind of material necessary in order to actually contribute to the discipline. So okay, we've kind of taken in this entire discipline. Here's our kind of taking our epistemology, our kind of framework for understanding the political, and then using that to produce our version of the discipline. And then it will probably become advantageous to ultimately attempt to affect kind of paradigm shifts in each of these disciplines, where we try and build alliances and connections with academics in the various fields who are interested in kind of.
Dude, anyone listening, I have Bitcoin. I do Bitcoin. You guys want to agree with? You want to do what he's doing? Do what I'm doing. You'll have to learn. I'll have to train you, right? Get a hold of me. I'll show you about tank hashing, master nodes, about mining. If you go to 2, the number 2, numeral 2, dreamcrypto.biz, you can put $40 in there. I'm more than happy to do that. That's very cursory. I can even show you which platforms you can get your Bitcoin on. Just kind of follow my lead. I'll show you, I'll educate you on how it's done. We'll move it forward, and then you can invest, and we can invest in these masternode Bitcoin projects that are preferable to the ideological function that we want to see the technology rolled out as. You see how what it is I'm doing is not dissimilar to what this guy's trying to shore up. He's just trying to like make one of his products like contemporary social control. So maybe he kissed some feminist ass a little too hard in school or something like that. So, or maybe it's just his bright idea to attempt to, and not that I'm against feminists. I like feminists. I like feminist theory. Totally. I'm just saying it seems like he's just trying to make a business practice political because he's somehow been augmented with some philosophical outlooks.
Using our ideas or working with us, where people who have got degrees in those fields could be hired to come in and be trained in our particular variant. And ultimately, like the idea is of the institutions, once that theory is in place, is really to train experts. It would be nice if we could manage to interface with real academia as it exists in universities. But ultimately, that's a question that I can't answer with how it's all going to flesh out. I just want to start by doing the work to get some theory down, create some output, put some get articles written, get essays written, potentially get books written, get discourse happening, get people talking, make connections, and see where it goes from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Long term, I think having people with the relevant degrees organized together is certainly helpful. In the meantime, I think it's good to focus on just how we set up our discourse so that we begin educable rather than relying exclusively on outside sources. Like, we have information that we can share with one another, and we have ways of determining who we would best benefit from being in communication with. So that's kind of the nature of my project, and maybe we'll work together in some capacity. But I think my prime focus right now from my end is just to get people talking to the right people and seeing and experimenting over many kind of weekly rounds of these sorts of conversations what the best setup will be. But was there any other?
That's kind of my approach as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're definitely in an experimental kind of place right now. Were there any other topics that you wanted to address before we end?
I think covered everything that we were going to talk about in this conversation. I think ultimately, I guess it's just probably good to finish up by emphasizing that, like, I recognize completely that this is just all kind of very speculative. It's very early on in the process. I'm a young guy. I'm 24 years old. A lot of the guys that I'm speaking to, they're basically in their 20s. We're not saying we have the answers. I think we've identified a lot of the problems, and it's a lot easier to do than coming up with the solutions. But I think having this discussion, then having identified the problems, and then beginning creative work on the solutions is a dynamic process. On some of the stuff that I've said today, even a year from now, I disagree with. The things that I've said a year ago, I definitely disagree with now. And so I guess the people who are watching along, just recognize that I'm this kind of, and I think all of us in this kind of discourse where this like public works in process. This is a very like new medium, trying to these kinds of discussions through like chat servers and things like that. It's not there's not a lot of precedent for doing this. So I guess I think everyone needs to kind of just recognize the process that we're in. I'm not like some 50-year-old guy with like 2 PhDs and all this like experience. But I think that there's an advantage to that in that I think by creating this kind of public discourse that kind of fuels of the ideas, then I think that's a really like authentic way to create a kind of movement of sorts, whatever that actually ends up meaning. Not like in some kind of weird democratic sense of like organizing into like doing like retard marches and stuff like that. But I mean in terms of this is the kind of base level from which organizations will kind of emerge and individuals will develop, unique ideas. And I think it's important that we recognize that this working process at the moment because ultimately this kind of thought is very new. I think right wing has been largely alienated from the academy. I wouldn't consider myself right wing or left wing, but in terms of, I think a lot of us come out of that kind of alienated. We aren't part of this kind of mainstream discourse. We see that there's something kind of inherently wrong with it. We want to construct something new. And so just kind of just being realistic about that. That's what we're doing. I think that's important to kind of recognize.
And you mentioned this is kind of the groundwork, and that is true, but there's also kind of an underground here of all of the reading that all of us have done and all the things we're in, which, the people involved with JoelDavis channel have circulated around a certain number of books and articles online, and that's been very helpful, I think, for integrating your thinking. And so I think in that vein, we ought to, establish a sort of canon of must-reads and get through them as effectively as possible with book clubs. So as far as like what to learn, I think at a canon level, as far as like the quadrivium or what everyone ought to know, you want to go broad spectrum, but specific philosophically. And so I think starting from the very beginning is good for what I want to do. I don't know if this will begin soon or in a couple months, but I got this book, the Pythagorean source book in the library. I'm going to start with Pythagorean studies, understand what all that was, because Plato makes reference to Pythagoreanism. Many people say he was a Pythagorean, and Aristotle makes reference to Pythagoreans. And there's a whole dialogue between the different ancient classical schools that in part was initiated by what Pythagoras did. Also the other pre-Socratics like Anaximander, Heraclitus, these people. It's good to have a basic understanding of them. So I think just a general history of philosophy is where I'm inclined. I've read plenty of articles online about from Stanford Encyclopedia.
So now Eric, of course, like, hey, I think a basic should be done. I think for what I want, it's from start to finish. This is where I started, and then he's basically just rounding it up from Western philosophy. Like, I think that's a good starting point, and he's throwing out the names so that other people read it and then maybe abide by them. I think it's funny because once again they're trying to garner agreement based on common reading lists, and Eric kind of jokingly says it like, oh well, in a couple of months I'll have all the classic Western philosophers down, and then it'd be good to talk with people that have that too. Like I said, if they can generate, if the future is given to the philosophers, then so be it. But even these guys aren't eye to eye on everything by any means, nor could they be.
In the process of getting through a nice thick history of Western philosophy book, and then I've read the philosophers I could read, but I think starting from the very beginning in an organized way would be of great benefit to everybody. That's my suggestion. But any last thoughts, concluding remarks before we stop?
I guess that, I love philosophy, and I know that for the rest of my life I probably always have this kind of fascination with trying to understand the history of ideas with greater and greater clarity. But then ultimately, what I want to do is not just create this little philosophy meetup, online, social club. The reason why I'm working through philosophical texts is to figure out a kind of epistemic basis from which to act in terms of creating actionable ideas that can be used in the real world.
Yeah, I totally agree. This isn't just for nerd purposes, but it's also in order to understand where our dialogue currently rests, and to really do need to grasp the whole of it. And that's why I've in the past focused on prehistory and understanding the origins of literacy and the origins of all these social structures. Because often we just start, this bothered me in school, when we start with 3100 BC, the first empires in Egypt and Sumer. It's like, well, what happened before that? These things just didn't appear out of nowhere, and there's no explanation of the fundamental processes, the underlying processes. And starting medias res just never really satisfied. Yeah, let's focus on the productive, but still, I think we have to have an expectation that people are familiar with this basic history.
Oh, do you? Have to have that? Okay. Well, interesting, huh? Well, maybe I have to part ways with these fellas. It's up to 1.5 speed. You guys probably pick it up that they're talking a little bit faster than I had them at 1.25 during the duration of this. So here we go. We'll just keep going.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot to learn from things like anthropology in general.
But I could have swore that Eric said, well, I'm not just doing this for business sake or entrepreneurial sake, which then made me chuckle like, oh, God, okay, so he recognizes it as, hey, we're really getting together to jack each other off as a commune and to do good business, right? Because we all want to be successful, right? So let's get together with these guys. And it is kind of interesting, the two guys that commented, it was Barklord and Wise Monkey. And those guys are back in the day when we were thrashing it out. A lot of people were thrashing out things, but we were coming at it from much more of a cookie cutter approach. I'm not saying people weren't sophisticated, but it was more of the early days of YouTube where anything went, and it was kind of a nice and shit showy. And it just seems like now the newer generations coming up, but they're just kind of lining up to get some business, get business of business done, business of business of business.
Mythological analysis that goes kind of back as far as Joseph Campbell kind of ventures back before the origin emerging civilization back to like hunter-gatherer society. And it's important, I think, to have that historical orientation. I wasn't saying when I said it's a criticism of you or anything. It was just more of just a kind of clarification. Often charges leveled at us, I think, somewhat kind of lazily. Not just you and I, but just generally people in our discourse that we're just, we're just engaging in kind of intellectual masturbation, and there's no real end to it. There's no real purpose to it of actionable goals, and I can't disagree more. I think there is. But we needed to get logical grounding right first, because before you can start, there's so many very smart people that have been working on these problems for thousands of years, trying to come up with solutions that have already been tried and failed, or there's all these arguments against it. Entire movement that have gone over hundreds of years in different directions from those ideas are already good. You just remain ignorant of them. It's really unproductive. Whereas if you analyze history and the history of ideas, you have the capacity to kind of avoid making a lot of the same mistakes.
Interesting. They don't even see their own paradox. He mistook and maybe it was just a word issue, and shifting out epistemology for ideology. But now he's, once again, he's in my favors because he's recognizing this, and he sounds good-willed. Joel, he's trying to, think that he's, like he's, there's other people that thought on this from other times, and we're trying to avoid the pitfalls, and I can't fault him for that, right? So in the end, once again, I'm okay with everybody. Oh boy, what a great day. Let's let the last 45 seconds play, and then maybe I'll do some last commentary.
Create a very kind of current, up-to-date worldview that is as informed as possible, so that we can actually go about doing something new and fresh. And maybe it'll also make a mistake, but at least it'll be something new and fresh that will provide therefore new knowledge and actually create progress in some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's encouraging that we have so many new social technologies to facilitate this. Whatever comes out of this, it will be fresh, and that's good at least. So thanks for coming on to have this discussion, Joel. Thanks for everybody for listening. And join both of our projects as much as possible. Contact Joel on Twitter or me through the Discord.
Okay, so my last thing to say, I mean, I think they kind of covered it, but basically it's like nothing new under the sun except for the new technology, and I'm glad we have it. And we can hope we can make some progress with it, which once again seems to echo the history of good-willed men and women throughout time trying to get shit happening. So at least I got some painting done right here. I'm going to show you guys the painting. I'm going to break it out in the last moment. Let's see if I'm even there, and then show you guys what I've been working on this whole time. Not that one. That one's done now. Oh yeah, my old man there, and then this here, what shit. Where am I at? Anyway, that's what I've been working on while I've been listening. It's kind of a crazy thing. I won't go into detail of who it is or why I'm doing it, but right on. Okay, well, that's the end of the stream. Let me go ahead and Piro even jumped in. Hey, Greatex and I were 10 weeks. Okay. Well, I'll keep that in mind, and I need to talk to Greatex because I'm going to London here in a month, and even though he's a Scot, maybe he can, come down for a bit or something, or something, and Karen or a conference report or any of the UKites that want to get a hold of me, send me a message, mikefahl@gmail.com, MikeFAHL@gmail.com if you'd like. It'd be good. It'd be good to see. I think Wise Monkey, you're Australian, right? Cheers, guys. Out. And thanks for listening.